I love historical dramas, fantasy and science fiction. My entire channel revolves around these genres. All the more often I've come across discussion where an actor or actress's appearance has been the subject of controversy. A common, though often vague, argument is that a face looks too modern and wouldn't fit the time period in which the story takes place. One example of this is the movie Wuthering Heights. I haven't seen it myself because the trailer alone made me feel an intense dislike for it, but that makes me all the more curious about the comments under such a controversial video, and I read the following comments. Heathcliff, it's me. I'm Barbie. I've come home. What the heck with the casting? Love Margot, but she looks like she's about to pull an iPhone at any moment. They surely had great dentists back then. Even though the film has sparked significant debate on so many levels, what I found interesting was the fact that the actors' appearances bothered many viewers. It was as if they didn't fit into the world of the story. Even though this film could easily be described as fan fiction rather than a serious attempt to do justice to the original material. Nevertheless, it was a problem for many viewers to see Margot Robbie, of all people, even though she was considered the perfect casting choice in other films. Only in Wuthering Heights does this not seem to be the case. She comes across as too modern, as if she had traveled back to the 18th century England in a time machine and immediately presented her iPhone to the others. But Wuthering Heights is just one example. Hollywood knows exactly what a beautiful face should look like today, and one increasingly gets the impression that only actors with the face of a supermodel are allowed in front of the camera. But it is precisely this perfection that can become a problem. Because the more modern this beauty appears, the harder it is for us to believe in the world in which it is supposed to exist. And this is exactly where a paradox arises. The look that is supposed to attract us can simultaneously pull us out of the story. So, which carries more weight? Aesthetics or authenticity? What exactly is a modern face? And why do we even think we know what people looked like in the past? Today, with the help of modern technology, we can reconstruct faces with astonishing precision based on skulls. Forensic reconstructions use muscle attachment points, tissue thicknesses, and statistical models to create digital faces. And yet these results have surprisingly little influence on how we imagine people from the Middle Ages or the Renaissance looked like. This is because our image of the past does not stem from science, but from culture. This is particularly evident when it comes to historical figures. Take Elizabeth I, bright red hair, a chalk-white face marked by pockmarks. For many, this image is almost taken for granted, and this is despite the fact that the scars, in particular, are not even visible in contemporary portraits. Our image of her is not a neutral reflection of reality, but a culturally shaped construct. It draws on paintings, theatrical productions, films, and TV series. In other words, on representations that are themselves already interpreted, stylized, and often idealized. Over time, this gives to a visual expectation, a kind of collective memory of what the past is supposed to look like. And this is precisely where the problem begins. Because when we see a face today, we unconsciously compare it to these internal images. If they match, it feels right. If they don't, friction arises. This is easy to explain. Our brain works with average images that we've learned from experience in the media. Everything that deviates too much from them seems wrong or jarring, even if it would be completely plausible objectively. And at the same time, we naturally bring our modern ideals of beauty into play. Symmetry, clear skin, perfect teeth, certain facial expressions, certain speech patterns, things that are heavily influenced by modern media. But when these modern markers become too prominent, a kind of cognitive dissonance arises. Two images collide, what we have stored as historically accurate and what we recognize as modern beauty. The result is not a clearly articulated thought, but rather a feeling. Something just doesn't fit. And it is precisely this feeling that many then describe as too modern. It gets interesting when you apply this to fantasy, because theoretically this argument shouldn't work there at all. There is, of course, no real-world model, and yet even there we perceive some faces as not fitting. For example, when we find an elf not pretty enough. This shows that it was never really about historical accuracy, but about expectations. Our expectations don't just arise out of thin air. They are the result of knowledge, experience, culture, media, taste, and the images we've been exposed to over the years. What we read, what we consume, the people we surround ourselves with, and the aesthetic preferences we develop. All of this shapes an internal image of what something is supposed to look like. In a film, even the slightest deviation can be enough to disrupt this expectation. Not because it's objectively wrong, but because it doesn't match what our minds have stored as credible. And that's exactly where the disruption begins. The story continues, but our immersion breaks for a moment. Part of this is simply a matter of casting. Sometimes you just don't like an actor without being able to explain why. That's frustrating, but hard to change. It's amplified even more by star power. Then you no longer see just the character, but always the famous person behind them as well. For example, I liked that in House of the Dragon, aside from Matt Smith, no well-known actors were cast. You immediately saw the character and not the actor. Because of this, I initially had a very hard time with the fact that in Dune, almost every character is played by a very famous actor. And it took me a while before I stopped seeing the actor and started seeing the character. Makeup and costumes are at least just as important. If this aspect doesn't work, a production immediately loses credibility. A film doesn't even have to be strictly realistic. What matters more is whether it feels consistent within itself. With Bridgerton, for example, it was clear to me from the start that it was more a romanticized, stylized fiction of history. In that context, it works. Especially with reinterpretations, you can consciously deviate from historical accuracy as long as the aesthetic choice remains understandable. With Wuthering Heights, however, this was taken so far that it generated more skepticism than interest in the film for me. And I'd only seen the trailer. A good counterexample is Dune. There, the costume department led by Jacqueline West achieved something that doesn't seem loud at first glance, but is all the more effective. The costumes subconsciously convey something about the character's origins, roles, culture, and hierarchy. Nothing feels random. That is precisely what makes the world feel believable, even though it is completely alien. This is perhaps the strongest proof that credibility in cinema depends not only on realism, but on creative consistency. Of course, the technical aspects also play a role. Camera work, lighting, color grading, editing, and post-production. For many viewers, these aren't immediately apparent, but they have a massive influence on whether something feels real or artificial. The intro to Rings of Power is a good example of this. To me, it initially looked heavily CGI driven, even though it was actually created using practical effects. This precisely demonstrates how quickly we misinterpret visual impressions when multiple small cues come together. In the end, it's not a single factor, but the interplay of casting, costumes, makeup, lighting, and staging. When several of these elements point toward the present, the feeling quickly arises that a character is too modern. And that's exactly when an aesthetic detail becomes a problem for the entire narrative. So why does it bother us so much to see beautiful people according to today's standards? Actually, we love looking at beautiful people. Beauty catches the eye. It sells movie tickets, TV shows, and magazines, and Hollywood has built an entire system around this over the decades. It favors faces that conform to our current ideal of beauty, even though this ideal is by no means historically neutral, but is constantly changing. But that is precisely the problem. We want beauty, but not the beauty of our present. We want authenticity, but only in a form that is compatible with what we have already stored as credible. As soon as a face looks too much like today, the image falls apart. Then we no longer see just a character in a story, but suddenly the present itself, with everything that is modern, polished, and familiar about it. This is particularly noticeable in a historical setting. Margot Robbie in Wuthering Heights can therefore seem so jarring to viewers because her appearance is inevitably interpreted through today's beauty standards. Flawless skin, perfect teeth, a look that is taken for granted in our time would be perceived as an extreme anomaly in the late 18th century. The issue isn't whether she is beautiful, but what kind of beauty she embodies. When the immersion breaks, it feels as though the story briefly loses its magic. Not because the film is objectively wrong, but because it violates an unspoken expectation. We then feel not merely irritated, but almost betrayed. Because the image on the screen promises something that our inner archive of history and aesthetics no longer accepts. This is the real paradox. The more cinema relies on perfect beauty, the more it risks undermining its own credibility. And the more it promises authenticity, the more sensitively we react to every detail that looks too much like our present.